everyone, Nathan here with PixelPipes, and we have something a little different and special today. I'm going to do something that's sort of a hybrid of, a Pixel Box episode, because obviously I do have a box here that I just received, but we're going to do a little bit more than that with this one. This package was sent to me by a seller on eBay who reached out to me quite a while ago and asked if I wanted to promote his eBay store, and in exchange I would get something from him and do a little video on it. So it took a while, but finally saw something that I was interested in, so I shot him a message, and here it is. So let's just get it open. All right. This is pretty cool. This is a GTS 450, and using a reference cooler by the looks of it. So that's pretty sweet. So yeah, the seller, the store is Abraham's Technology. The cool thing is they're a local store here in Florida. So, I was more than happy to promote a local business, and seemed to be a really nice person and a really nice guy, and obviously did a great packing job. So definitely check out his store. Really what I want to talk about though is this card in particular, because this is kind of a unique card. I don't usually go for cards like this, but I saw it and I investigated it a little bit, and not really knowing much about the GTS 450, but actually it's a little bit more interesting than at first would appear, because this is based on the GF106 GPU, which according to the Tech Power Up database, this is pretty much the only card that was released as a retail consumer card based on that GPU. Everything else that I've found is all OEM graphics cards or mobile GPUs or Quadro GPUs. So for whatever reason, the GF106 did not get very much use at all. This was pretty much it as far as a consumer retail edition card goes. So I'll be eager to go ahead and install this here. I'm actually not sure if this is the retail version. I mean, it's got obviously a reference cooler design on there. Just to give you a general rundown of the specs, this thing has a core clock of 738 megahertz with a separate shader clock exactly double that at 1566. It's got a memory clock effectively of 3600, so this was using GDDR5 memory, and 192 stream processors, which with the introduction of Fermi, NVIDIA officially renamed those to CUDA cores, and 32 texture mapping units and 16 raster op back ends. That's a pretty decent, spec sheet for something of a mainstream-oriented card. Certainly for its day. I mean, this has probably put a number of high-end cards from just a couple generations before it, certainly give them a decent run for their money. But, I'm not really sure until I put it in and find out. Alright, so now we have the card installed, drivers are all set up, and I believe we're running 340.52. We'll just look in the system info, and there it is. Now, we're running this through the capture card at 1080p, at least for the desktop. Not every game is going to support HD resolutions if you're going to play retro games, and that really is kind of the point of this video. We're going to use the GTS 450 to play retro games, and one of the really cool things about the GTS 450 is that you could pretty much enable all of these, well, the main ones here, like anti-aliasing, so we can crank that up. We'll do this one, so we can get 8x. This is 8x anti-aliasing with 16x coverage sampling, so it covers more pixels with 8 samples. And then for transparency anti-aliasing, we can also turn that on if we want to. And it might have some compatibility issues depending on the game. We're not going to crank it up all the way because it gets a little excessive, but 4x is pretty good. And then for anisotropic filtering, of course, we can go ahead and turn that up to 16x. And there we go. It's one of those situations you could pretty much turn it on and forget it, with the exception of a couple of games. Now, yeah, admittedly, the title of this video is a joke. I mean, this is a graphics card that came out in 2010, and it's being used to play games, you know, going back to 2002, 2003, up to, say, 2007. So obviously, this is just kind of, that's just kind of a parody of some other videos that you might see on YouTube trying to use budget graphics cards in modern games. But this is kind of a twist on that, because yeah, we're going to be using it to play retro games, and you can get a really good experience doing that. So let's go ahead and try a few out. First, with Serious Sam, the second encounter, we're going to just go into well, I don't have any auto save, so we'll use a quick save here, and it's pretty much the beginning of the game. But yeah, I have anti-aliasing cranked up to 16xq CSAA, which basically means 8x with extra coverage samples. But what's really going to hit the frame rate is the 4x super sampling transparency AA. This card has a 128-bit memory interface, but it is using GDDR5, and that kind of mitigates a lot of the shortcomings of having a narrower memory interface, and especially since we're playing these older games, it's not really going to be much of an issue. I mean, some of these textures already had transparencies built in, so it's a little redundant, but in these trees up here, you're going to really take care of these guys. Yeah, these trees are really going to show it, like in those vines. That super sampling anti-aliasing is going to really smooth that stuff out, and there's lots of games from this era that benefit from that. But as you can see, we are routinely running at 150 frames and up on our average, and there's no problems whatsoever. Again, you can pretty much set it to the settings in the driver and forget it with these retro games. This is a very inexpensive card. When it came out, it was $129, and now you can get it for, you know, $40 or, you know, less if you're patient. Pretty inexpensive card, pretty easy on power consumption as well. Oh boy. And yeah, it's just gonna run these games without any trouble whatsoever. Of course. Now in Halo, unfortunately, this game has never supported anti-aliasing, but you can still get the benefits of anisotropic filtering. And right now the resolution is set to a very conservative 1280 by 1024. This is a game that supports up to 1600 by 1200. But it is still pretty much limited to vintage, or I should say more retro-friendly 4:3 or 5:4 aspect ratios. And if we just continue where I left off in the campaign, again, we're pretty much right in the beginning of the game. So obviously I don't use this system for playing games very much. This is, of course, using my Core 2 Duo system running at 4.5 gigahertz on an E8600, so pretty decent, fast processor, but unfortunately this is one of those games where the animation is limited to 30 frames per second, but the game itself can run at excessively high frame rates. So, oh, we're gonna go into a cutscene here. And the cutscene's limited to 30 frames per second, but I guarantee that you're going to be running hundreds of frames per second in this game. And if you have a monitor, say 1920 by 1200, then you can run the 1600 by 1200 resolution, or even better, if you have a monitor that supports 1600 by 1200 natively, then you are good to go.
It must have been one of their boarding parties.
Next, we're going to jump ahead to Unreal Tournament 2004. So this will be the first game of 2004, and we're going to need to tweak the INI file. So we'll go to the target exe, and right next to it is the configuration settings. Scrolling down, we're going to find the full screen resolution here, and we should be able to customize this to allow for full 1080p. Obviously, it's a little weird looking, a little stretched. Was not optimized for widescreen, but yeah, I mean, it's gonna run. So let's go ahead and jump into a quick match here. And yeah, I mean, this is obviously no problem whatsoever. Full HD. And yeah, none of this is gonna really come as a surprise to pretty much anybody. I mean, we are here at over 100 frames per second. Now, I don't get to enjoy that since I'm using a capture card right now. It's only capturing at 30 frames per second, and that's the limit of my capture card that I'm using at this moment. But, you know, if you're viewing this natively direct to a monitor, this is going to be an extremely smooth experience. And, yeah, I don't know if there's really anything else I need to explain here. It's just, it's going to work really well. Next, we're going to run Half-Life 2, and Half-Life 2 is one of those games. It gets a little weird about when you try to override the anti-aliasing setting. It's better to use the enhanced setting there. Kind of why it's there in the first place for those games that are picky. But once you set that, you should be pretty much good to go. And it does support widescreen. It's one of the few vintage games, or should say retro games, not quite vintage, that does support full HD, high resolution, widescreen settings. And there we go. And so even with anti-aliasing cranked all the way up, and all the foliage and everything, all the alpha textures using super sampling, it's completely smooth. And I do have a save a little bit later, still in the beginning of the game. But yeah, we're still in the hundreds here. So just a great card for playing retro games. And it's still a little bit of a retro card in itself, although 2010 is kind of stretching the definition a bit. In for another cutscene. And here we are in that same spot from the title screen. This is about the lowest the frame rate's going to get, at least early on. And yeah, it does dip below 100 frames per second, but when you're talking the 70s and 80s, it's still pretty smooth. So yeah, I'm not going to go through every game that I have on this system. I think you get the idea. But one game I'm sure a number of you are curious about is Crysis. But for that, we're going to need to turn off these settings. Crysis is a game that, obviously has a certain reputation for a reason. I mean, even though this is a graphics card that came out in 2010, and the graphics card industry had made a lot of strides in, the few years since 2007 when this game came out, it's still tough to play. Can it run Crysis? Well, we're going to go easy on it because we are running at the native 1080p resolution. This is a $129 budget graphics card from 2010, so it may still be a challenge to run here. And yeah, at low settings, it's not really a problem. There's popping like crazy. The lighting is extremely primitive looking. My right mouse button is not working right. There we go. So real quick, let's just see if we can change the settings over to medium and just see how that does. Actually, not bad. This is definitely not a game that you really want to run any lower than medium settings anyway, because low it just doesn't really look right. The lighting is just really strange, since most of the lighting systems are disabled. Medium is kind of how a lot of people played this game when it first came out. And here we have a budget graphics card from a few years after this game came out that can run it just fine. And medium is pretty well optimized compared to the highest settings, especially if you're talking DirectX 10 mode, which a lot of people pretty much ignored because there wasn't really much of an improvement in graphical quality compared to just DirectX 9 and high. But as interesting as it is to just watch me play games and see a frame rate counter up in the corner, I think what would probably be more interesting is to see how this graphics card compares to high-end cards from previous generations. Because again, with the progress that graphics cards made in this time frame in the early 2000s, it wasn't uncommon for budget cards, newer budget cards, to actually perform as good or better than flagships from just a couple generations back. So what do you say we put that to the test? Let's pull out some benchmarks, and I'm going to assume my recording voice, and we'll go over some results compared to several previous generation graphics cards in several games. As usual, we'll start with the synthetic tests first, using the same test system as before under Windows XP. And you can see in 3D Mark 05 that the GTS 450 is able to take the lead by a small margin over every other card on the chart, though it is possible we're running into CPU limitations here. 3D Mark 06 shows more interesting scaling, and we see the GTX 280 pull ahead with a fairly consistent decrease in performance for each card under that, until you get to the fixed pipe cards at the bottom, which drop quite a bit from the rest of the pack. This is one of the few instances where you'll see the GTS 450 beating the 8800 GTX. Halo is a fun game to test because with the right map, scaling is almost unlimited, and here we see an absolutely ridiculous frame rate on the GTX 280, almost doubling the performance of the 8800 GTX, which represents pretty much perfect scaling given its paper specs. The GTS 450 drops a little behind the 8800 GTX, but the 2900 XT shows disappointing performance, only slightly ahead of the fixed pipe cards from the generation before it. Far Cry puts the GTS 480 behind the 8800 GTX again, but it's only by a small margin. Scaling isn't extreme in this game, but it's pretty steady going down the chart, showing good performance even for the fixed pipe cards. In Half-Life 2, the resolution limits performance and the CPU becomes the bottleneck. Since I'm just using test results I already had, I didn't have results for higher resolution, but pretty much every card here is going to give you good performance. Doom 3 shows better scaling, and surprisingly, the GTS 450 doesn't do that well here. Even the 2900 XT is able to best it, coming close to the 8800 GTX, with the GTX 280 jumping ahead of the rest of the lineup by a decent amount. Fear is another great showing for the GTX 280, and the GTS 450 snuggles up close to the 8800 GTX again, with enough performance headroom that you could easily turn on AA and AF if you so chose. Lastly, we have Crysis, and here's where the strengths of the Fermi's architectural enhancements come into play, showing a decent improvement over the 8800 GTX at high settings, with a conservative 1024x768 resolution. All cards with unified shaders do reasonably well here, with only the fixed pipe cards showing their limitations with a game clearly built with the future in mind. Alright, so there you have it. There's a quick look at the GTS 450. Really interesting kind of budget card from some years back, several years back now. It's going on 9 years. And you know, when this card came out, it was an inexpensive, low power solution. You know, this thing's only rated with a TDP of 106 watts, and yet it compares very closely to an 8800 GTX from, you know, a few years prior. You know, that card came out in late 2006, and it had a TDP of 155 watts. So quite a difference, especially when you're talking about you know, the heat dissipation in your case. I can tell you right now, this card runs extremely cool. So very nice for retro gaming, and you know, even being able to play some more modern games such as, you know, Crysis and BioShock, you know, games right up through 2007 with quite a bit of gusto there. So, I mean, yes, you could get an 8800 GTX and have something maybe a little bit more historically noteworthy, but this card is a nice solution if you don't want to, you know, say do retro gaming while also making a you know, noticeable impact on your power bill. So that's why it's kind of interesting to me, and maybe it is to some of you, especially those of you who actually used this card back in the day when it came out. So once again, thanks to Abraham's Technology for sending this card along. And again, we tried something a little different here, you know, a bit of an unboxing and kind of a, I guess, a sort of let's play, showing how games run, and also some benchmarks as well, reusing some of the results that I had for other cards that I already tested. Just something I could whip together, you know, quickly, and hopefully you found it entertaining. And if so, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of this sort of bite-size video here. But yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching. I'm Nathan, and this has been PixelPipes.